I'd like to do my best to analyze and break down what I see as a major myth about trauma, a falsity about trauma. I hear it inside the mental health system, I hear it from mental health professionals, I hear it from mental health patients, and I hear it just in general out in the news, out in the world, in articles. And what it is the idea that you can just heal trauma pretty simply. That people with post-traumatic stress disorder even, can do this, that, and the other, this technique, this therapeutic technique, this drug even, psilocybin, MDMA, whatever it is they can do. Tapping, EFT, things with lots of letters, fancy scientific names. Take this thing, do this thing, and your trauma will go away. You can knock it out. And the reason that I don't like that, the reason it really bothers me, is I don't see it as true at all. Yes, I do believe that there's lots of different things that people can do to resolve a trauma, or a part of a trauma, or help someone resolve to some degree some part of a trauma. But the idea that a person can no longer be traumatized by some technique, that, oh, I used to be traumatized, but now I'm not traumatized anymore. It's like, I don't buy that. That's not what I observe. What I have observed in people is that often what gets labeled as trauma, what gets labeled as their traumatized part, is actually just the thin little tip of the iceberg, the part that comes above the surface of the water. It was a basic criticism I had of Judith Herman's classic book, Trauma and Recovery. A book that I loved and a book that really helped me, but my basic criticism of it, the reason I would never give it 5 out of 5 stars, is even she, this amazing researcher and clinician on trauma, on post-traumatic stress, doesn't see how deep trauma goes in people, or much less how common trauma is, or that everybody is traumatized. Trauma is the basis of the modern screwed up human character. Everybody I know is traumatized. Oh, one might say, oh, you just have a biased sampling because you were a therapist. Well, I'm almost 50. I was only a therapist for 10.5 years of my life. I've been observing people a lot longer than that, 10 years since being a therapist and a lot of years before. And what I see is everybody is traumatized, myself included. So when they say, oh, you can just knock out a trauma quickly, well, the people who say this are people, from what I've seen, who really haven't explored their childhoods that much. They don't know what their childhood really was because they never really got into the emotions. They don't relate very well to other children. And how can they? Because they don't relate to the child that they once were. And then I'll take it to the next step. They don't relate to the child who they still are. Judith Herman points that out, I believe, in Trauma and Recovery. Other trauma researchers have said it, and I certainly saw it as a therapist. One of the things that happens when people get traumatized is it stunts their development at the age at which they were traumatized. Not the development of their whole personality, but the part of their personality that got traumatized. So people can be stunted at lots and lots of different ages. Maybe a large part of their personality is stunted at 5 years old, or 7 years old, or 13 years old. All these war veterans who were traumatized at 18 and 19 years old, and at some level a big part of their personality never developed past the age of 18 and 19. I certainly heard that when I was a therapist working with combat vets. They taught that to me. But what people don't acknowledge very much in society is the degree to which most people have whole large parts of their personality stunted at 4, 5, 6 years old because of what happened to them in their childhoods. And the reason people don't talk about this so much is it means calling out parents. And so often in our society, parents get a pass. Parents are allowed to screw up and traumatize their children, but it's not considered trauma. It's not considered horrible for the children. It's considered regular, normal, healthy child rearing. It's considered a way to stop them from becoming spoiled. The things that parents so commonly do to their children, stuff considered normal. If someone was not a parent and did that to that child, they could get arrested. They'd go to jail for it. They'd never be allowed to be around children again. And yet parents get a pass. In fact, they can go on and have other children. People can know what these parents are doing to their children. And they look the other way. Oh, I don't want to see it. I don't know it. Oh, it's fine. Don't worry. Your mommy loves you. Your daddy loves you. They turn a blind eye. And so often, so does society. So do mental health professionals so often. When I was studying to become a therapist, they taught us you have a responsibility to break the confidentiality of your clients and call the police on them and turn them in if you hear any bit of child abuse that they are doing to their children or to any other children. One might say it's fair. I don't like the idea of therapists actually having to be agents of the state, being an arm of the police force. I don't think it's a good idea. It doesn't allow people at basic to feel safe to tell about what's really going on in their lives in therapy, much less to change. However, the real criticism I have against this is all parents are abusing their children to one degree or other. All parents are violating their children and causing trauma in their children. Trauma, overwhelming emotional feelings that the children feel, horror and terror that the children go through, that they have to bury to be able to survive in their families. And the reason most people don't see it is because it's too painful to see it. If they saw it in those children, they'd have to see it in themselves, and they've blocked it out, they've split it off. They don't empathize with the child within them, they don't empathize with the child that they once were, and by extension, they don't empathize with other children. So when they say, oh, you should have healed your traumas long ago, Daniel, you're making a mountain out of a molehill, you're more traumatized than others, you must not be very good at healing traumas if you've been working at it for 20-something years inside yourself and you still haven't figured it all out. I look at them and say, you haven't even started. You've barely even scratched the surface of your traumas. So to me, to come back to myself and my healing process, in relation to the idea of really deeply healing all of our traumas, for me, healing traumas is a lifestyle. It's not a lifestyle that in an ideal world I would want. Who wants to deal with traumas all the time? I'd rather deal with the beauty of nature. I'd rather deal with being free and being creative and being healthy. But from what I've seen for myself and for others is that if you don't deal with your traumas, if you don't figure out ultimately how to deal with all of them, you'll never be able to live up to your full potential. You'll never be able to enjoy the full beauty of nature, the full beauty of the nature that's within you, because as long as you're even partially traumatized, you're split off with your true nature, your true wild self within. Your inner child will always be stunted to some degree. And so I've made a lifestyle out of trying to fully heal my traumas. And what I've seen is in this world that does so much denying, not just of traumas, but of the totality, of the immensity, of the enormity of traumas in our human species, I don't have too many allies. I don't have too many people that can reflect back to me the reality, not just of what I see, but what I live and what I experience. And so it's harder. It's harder to heal traumas without allies. It's harder to do anything without true peer support, to have true people who understand what I'm talking about. So it's like I'm more lonely on this path. And in effect, I have to go through the world a lot of times being quiet, not being able to speak about what I'm going through. Living in an unspeakable way. Living with my traumas remaining unspeakable. And if they remain unspeakable, it's harder to heal them, just like Judith Herman said. When things are unspeakable, how can you bring it out? How can you give it air? How can you let the light hit it? How can it develop and nurture and heal? How can reality come into the equation? And when we live in a species where 99% of traumas remain unspeakable because people are so into protecting parents, giving parents a pass for their bad behavior, well, the traumas remain unspeakable and they remain in denial, and people can live with this fantasy. Mental health professionals can live with this fantasy. The whole mental health field can live with this fantasy and promulgate this fantasy that traumas are just a little small thing, that we can knock them out, make them go away, and then we can go on and live healthy lives and be happy and have relationships and have children and not traumatize them, not be traumatizing partners. And from what I've seen is, it's just not true.